Tonight on Nation to Nation, Winnipeg MP says Ottawa is still failing missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls.
5 years since the national inquiry into missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, and quite frankly, there's been very little movement.
The president of the Manitoba Métis Federation says it's time to set the record straight on who and who is not Métis.
We need to educate not just our people and first, whether it's the Red River Métis or First Nation people, educate Canadian politicians.
A representative of the Nunavut Inuit Women's Association says the COVID-19 pandemic further exposed food insecurity.
It really lifted off the cover as to how destitute some homes were in being able to have access to food.
Welcome to Nation to Nation. I'm Fraser Needham. This coming Sunday is Red Dress Day, a day to honor families and victims affected by the issue of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. At the same time, it has now been almost 5 years since the National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls released its final report, with most of the documents, 231 calls to justice, remaining unfulfilled. Joining me today to talk about Red Dress Day and other related issues is Winnipeg NDP MP and longtime MMIWG advocate Leah Gazan. Welcome back to Nation to Nation, Ms. Gazan.
Oh, thanks so much for having me.
All right, so I mentioned it's been about 5 years since the final report on MMIWG was released. Would you say since that time, I guess, are we moving ahead on these issues, staying the same, or actually moving back?
Well, we know, in fact, rates of violence have gone up since the pandemic. Like you said, it's been almost 5 years since the national inquiry into missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. And quite frankly, there's been very little movement by the federal government. I'm happy that, it looks like we're moving forward with a red dress alert. I think that's a step in the right direction. But the fact is, that's at the end game. We need prevention. We need things put in place so that Indigenous women and girls don't go missing or murdered.
I guess in turning to the previous, this budget and previous, or comparing it to previous budgets, previous ones had a whole, chapter dedicated to MMIWG issues. This year's only makes passing mention to the issue of with 1.3 million over 3 years to explore a red dress alert system. And of course, as you're aware, and we've talked about it too on our network, that neither the word Indigenous peoples or reconciliation was even mentioned in the finance minister's budget speech. Are you concerned that maybe the government is moving on from MMIWG?
Well, I've been very clear. I mean, there's 22 million that's put directly in the line to deal with murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls, 20 million of course, to go to searching the landfill in Winnipeg, which, I 100% support, and 1.3 million for the red dress. Yet they put 45 million in the budget to deal with auto theft. And what I've said is, look, I know that auto theft is a big deal in this country, but it sends a very clear message that Canada cares more about cars than it does about Indigenous women and girls in this country. That's what I call normalized genocide. That's what I call normalized violence. So I'm disappointed that there's not more investment, and I think it's indicative of how this government and former governments, conservative governments, has failed. Let's not forget former Prime Minister Harper, when we were fighting for a national inquiry into murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls, was very clear that we were, in quotes, not on his radar. And, it's one thing to say niceties, and the Liberals are really great about that. It's another one to show those niceties through action. And I call on the federal government to stop with the niceties, stop with the platitudes, and have real investments so that we don't even need to utilize a red dress alert.
Now, one of the things I've noticed that's come up a couple times in committee from witnesses is that there's a lot of resistance to having really the police oversee this. People say it has to be led by Indigenous groups and not. The trust simply isn't there with police if they're sort of leading the charge on this. Is that something you think that they need to keep in mind as they develop the system?
Well, absolutely. You know, there's no secret that we have issues of systemic racism that are ongoing in Canada, and that impacts all systems, whether it's the health system. We certainly know in the justice system. You know, the national inquiry into missing and murdered Indigenous women was very clear in its calls for justice for police. I would say that if you look at what's happening in Thunder Bay right now, they have failed to address the severity of the situation. And I do support calls for independent oversight. And I do think that if we are going to look at system change, if we are going to reconcile in this country with issues of systemic racism, then we need to be honest about the current state of our systems, and we need to change things to make sure they work. Right now, they're not working. We know that through the national inquiry. We know that from stories from families and advocates on the ground. So I absolutely support putting forward a system and putting in measures in place that address ongoing systemic racism in systems to make sure that systems work for the very people they're supposed to protect.
I'm just going to move on to another issue you've been active in, of course, and this is a search of the Prairie Green landfill, which the latest, I guess, is both the province of Manitoba and federal government have each pledged $20 million to search the Prairie Green landfill for the remains of Morgan Harris and Mercedes Myron. It's been a couple of years now since this was first reported, and there's been quite a bit of time that's passed by. Are you confident that we're going to see any actual action in the near future on this issue?
In terms of, sorry, just to clarify, in terms of searching the landfill?
Yes, that's right, yeah.
Okay, well, you know, I'm glad that, you know, there's been money allocated by the province and by the feds to search the landfill. You know, certainly I know the families and advocates continue to push for the search to begin. I certainly support that. I think the allocation of funding is certainly a really good step in the right direction to make sure that this happens. And I'm hopeful for the families that they get the closure that they so deserve. And also, you know, that the women who have been lost to this genocide get to rest in dignity.
And of course, you're working on the ground a little closer than we are here in Ottawa, because it's in Winnipeg, where you represent. Have you been able to get, though, any timeline of when they might actually start the actual search from federal officials or from the province of Manitoba?
Well, I do know that it's happening in the near future. I don't have specific guidelines. But again, you know, I'm glad that it's underway, and I'm glad that the families hopefully will get the closure that they so deserve.
Okay, well, we're going to have to leave it there. I know you're busy today, of course, voting and doing your House duties, but as always, thanks for joining us here on Nation to Nation.
Thanks for having me. Take care.
Up next, we'll have Manitoba Métis Federation President David Chartrand to talk about an upcoming summit the organization is co-hosting on Métis identity theft. Welcome back. In recent years, a serious debate has been raging over who is and who is not legitimately Métis in Canada. The Manitoba Métis Federation says in order to be Métis, a person must be historically connected to the Red River area. The Métis Nation of Ontario argues there are historic Métis communities in the province. The dispute led to the MMF leaving the Métis National Council in 2021. Later this month, the MMF will be hosting an identity summit in Winnipeg along with the Chiefs of Ontario. Joining me today to talk about it all is President of the Manitoba Métis Federation, David Chartrand. President Chartrand, thanks very much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
All right, I guess we'll start with this Identity Summit coming up a little bit later in May. Can you tell us a bit about it and why the MMF is hosting it?
Well, clearly, there's several fronts. First is we see more an abundance of identity theft happening, but at a smaller scale, where it's individuals, you know, using it to become professors or judges and lawyers and other ways of taking advantage of the Indigenous identity and using that as a tool to advance their careers. You could see that in a singular view, and you're able to probably deal with it by policy, but now we're seeing a national group taking on not one person. We're talking tens of thousands, potentially hundreds of thousands of people to come in claiming that they're part of the Métis history and Métis culture. And clearly, you can do all the research you want. You'll never connect us to those people. We have no historical connection to them whatsoever. We are the national government of the Red River Métis. We signed an agreement in 2021 with Canada. And our homeland actually stems from an edge inside of Ontario all the way to the Rockies and parts of the United States and part of the Northwest Territories. That's our homeland. We can prove it without doubt. Historical fact can show that. Now, these that claim now to be us, taking our flags, taking our heroes, taking Riel, taking Giba Jumon, taking our beadwork, taking our any symbolism about who we are, and even the struggle and the hardship and the horror of what happened to us as a people, all the way from 1800s, first battle in 1816, 1870, and 1885, and then ongoing discrimination that we still face today, that we're still fighting. So they're trying to own that unfortunate part of history and say that's the struggles they face to gain accessibility, to gain opportunity for programs and services that we are finally winning in the courts and getting now some of our tax dollars back to start making changes in our families and communities. So that's this issue is stemmed so big. The CO, of course, the Ontario First Nations got together, and we got together, and we decided we need to have a summit. We need to educate not just our people and first, whether it's the Red River Métis or First Nation people, educate Canadian politicians. There's still a lot of unknowns of people that don't understand our history. People still think those people like Ottawa and all those people from those into Quebec are our people. They're not our people. But because history, our schools have done a poor job in our education system of educating who we are. So I think the First Nations too are fed up with it. They can't take it no more. They're seeing their ancestors being robbed of their identity, that they're connecting to those ancestors which belong to the First Nation. And clearly at the end of the day, First Nations have it right. If you were here, how come we never heard of you? Like, where were you? You couldn't have been hiding for over 150 years or 200 years. Like, so where were you? And who are you? So where's your history? Where's your culture? Don't steal the Red River Métis culture. So who are you? Tell us your story. Tell us your history. You know, the problem they have is they don't have one. They don't have a culture. So they're trying to steal somebody else's culture, both First Nation Métis. So this conference is hopefully going to start to educate, coordinate our positions as Indigenous leaders, national leaders, and of course the First Nations in Ontario are as I said, I repeat again, are fed up. They can't not take it no more. And they're seeing their lands and their territories and everything they've suffered for being stolen by a new people. And it's a dangerous thing. And because we're not talking about one person, we're talking about tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands in the future that can claim the identity of the definition that MNO Ontario will propose as the new definition for all Métis that are coming, but still under our culture and our suffering and our identity.
Now, do you think that the federal government's Bill C-53, which would formally recognize the Métis Nation of Ontario, has that brought some of these matters to a head?
I think it helped. It helped in a way. Unfortunately, it was done wrong. If there's proper consultations with the First Nations and us with the Red River, we could have clarified. As you know, they openly admitted, Canada openly admitted they did not look at the identity at all, and they just allowed the MNO to be accepted the way they were proposing themselves to be accepted. And so when you look at Bill 53, if they would have done proper consultations, as we have, because our treaty is coming before Parliament eventually, and when we look at it, we've done years and years of work on it and years of consultation. And so, and truly there's history now. There's a history connected to a people, a true history that can be showcased. So, and without doubt, everybody knows that everybody should know who we are. Some people in the East still have to learn who we are. But at the end of the day, the Red River Métis are without question an historic people who built Canada. We negotiated Manitoba into Confederation. We bought Western Canada Confederation. So we fought to protect the lands of the West. So when you look at history, that's not going to be an issue for us. But we've done years and years of consultation, years and years of negotiations, and all of a sudden MNO comes out of nowhere, and that's caused such a uproar, because now we see that the theft of our identity is going to be taken not only from the Red River Métis, but also from the First Nations. So First Nations and us are going to work together to try to protect our identity, but educate people at the same time.
Now, earlier this week, the federal government passed Bill C-29. That's to establish a national council to monitor reconciliation or progress on reconciliation. The Métis National Council holds the seat on that council. What's your thoughts on that?
Well, again, MNC is not a legitimate organization. So, there are others like me, national leaders, who have different opinions on this body. Clearly, that we have similar views, and for me, I see it as a tool, a potential tool in the future. It can do more damage than good, because depending on the politician and depending on the degree of pressure, they may want to deflect their pressure against themselves on matters of unconstitutional settlements that are occurring or matters of rights being affected, where they can turn to the body and say, well, no, the body's saying this particular position at this time and opposing your view as a national leader, the Red River Métis, for example. So we don't support it. I think it's late in coming. I told you, Dan, let's give him time. In June 22nd, we had a discussion. We also had in October. And I gave the government time to write a letter and to say, things have changed since then. We signed an agreement, self-government agreement in 2021 with Canada, recognizing us as the National Red River Métis. And so now you're saying a different body is going to be speaking on my behalf. There's no sense to that. So from my perspective, I think things have changed before this body has been installed in Canada. And the purpose now is to ask the question, why?
Okay, well, we'll have to end it there. Always lots to talk about, of course. But thanks very much again, President Chartrand, for joining us today.
Yeah, thank you very much for having me on.
After the break, we'll talk to Tara Tutu Fotheringham of the Nunavut Inuit Women's Association about a new report on child poverty. Welcome back. A new report shows child poverty rates are on the rise in Canada. According to Campaign 2000, child poverty rose from 13.5% to 15.6% between 2020 and 2021. Nowhere was the rise in child poverty more stark than in Nunavut, where child poverty rose by 7.7% to 35.8%. And looking at children just under the age of 6, this rate comes in at an alarming rate of 43.2%. Joining me today to talk about this report and child poverty is Tara Tutu Fotheringham. She's the Vice President of the Board of the Nunavut Women's Association. Ms. Tutu Fotheringham, welcome to Nation to Nation.
Thank you, Fraser, for having me.
All right, so I guess we'll get into the results of the report. We have known that child poverty has been an issue for a number of years in Nunavut. Was there anything in particular in the report that came as a surprise to your organization?
Well, lots came as a surprise. We've gone through such a change with access to food since the pandemic. It really lifted off the cover as to how destitute some homes were in being able to have access to food when at the time with the pandemic, there was a requirement to stay indoors, not go out. So, some people were able to still have an income coming in, depending on who their employer was. Some people who are probably the most impoverished were the ones that, worked hour to hour, were not able to get, an income to help support while the pandemic was on. So that was really harsh to see on paper that we are that high in our poverty.
What are some of the solutions you see to this problem, as we were just kind of discussing before we got started here?
Yes. Well, that's a bit of a two-part question, because when the northern retailers are required to submit for claim on the products that they sell, they actually don't have to prove that they've sold the products to anybody particularly. They just have to prove that they purchased the products and they ship them to their destination. So because of that, there is a little bit less transparency as to knowing who is actually purchasing the goods and if they're getting the full benefit back. Whereas if you're a southern retailer in the Nutrition North program, every invoice you sell to a customer in the north has to be matched up against the way bill and has to be matched up against that you've given the full subsidy. So the transparency for southern retailers is much more stringent than it is for the northern retailers. And then I believe, you know, the next thing that you're saying, if there's going to be any changes, I do have good news to report on that. Nutrition North, I think, has, you know, definitely been in the fire for a while on their program policies, but they did just do an announcement that's actually effective as of May 1st, that they will now allow all items that are under the Nutrition North subsidy program, and that being level 7, 1, 2, 3, and 4, will allow now people to get a subsidy on all those items through sea lift or ice roads. It is still too early to understand what magnitude that will actually present for helping, you know, curb some of the food insecurity that we have seen for years, but it's a start. So, you know, we're excited as an organization to hopefully be able to do a follow-up to this report card, because we think that with that change and maybe people going back to being able to afford to do annual sea lift orders, we might be able to see more food in the cupboards.
As you know, it's always sad stories when you cover child poverty across Canada. Of course, it's even worse when it's going up. But you know, these numbers, especially if you look at the children under 6, which is really children, of course, that need good nutrition more than anybody. The number at 43% of children, that's just amazingly high in the area of Nunavut. What do you think are some of the solutions maybe that governments or you know, organizations can do to really tackle this problem in the near term, because it's really is quite alarming?
Well, I think part of the solution is several solutions. You know, there are programs that are being implemented, such as breakfast programs, into a lot of the schools in the North now. Jordan's principal, through the Indigenous network group, has been funding more projects than Nunavut. For example, there are 4 communities in the Kivalliq region that are going to be participating in a disbursement of $500 a month for children 3 and up for the next 12 months. So we really hope we can participate right at the start of this of these deliveries, so that we can start to see what that support is impacting. So like I said, we hope we can do a follow-up to this data report card. But the other thing to consider is that with getting breakfast programs in place in schools, also with this extra support now coming through for hamlets in the Kivalliq region, where they're going to have more food available into the home. But it comes down to, we need to start implementing food shopping literacy. Too many times, food that is not as healthy, but it's quick to serve, is the most costly goods to purchase. So I believe we need to start looking at food literacy and how we can enhance people to know how to smart shop.
Well, certainly a very big issue that we're covering, and obviously when you're highlighting, and thanks very much for bringing it to our attention. We'll have to leave it there, but once again, thanks for joining us today on Nation to Nation.
Thank you very much for having us.
And that concludes this week's episode of Nation to Nation. If you missed any part of tonight's show, you can check out our podcast at aptnnews.ca/podcast. I'm Fraser Needham. Good night.